Creating an environment is simple, right? But no, it's not actually as simple as that. Okay, you know what name you want to give it, but does that name actually make sense? Is that name going to help you in the future? What else do you need to consider? Security groups, Dataverse, so many things to think about. Watch this video and we'll teach you what you should think about and just how to create an environment nicely. Welcome to everyone. Today we're going to be talking about how to create an environment, what's involved in that, what you need to consider, and also how you might decide to automate that. So Josh, you're in the driving seat. Take it away.
I'm in the driving seat. Thanks, Charles. Yeah, so let's look at environment creation today, what we can do, how we can do it. As you can see here, we've gone into the Power Platform Admin Center, admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com. I've then clicked into Manage and then Environments, and that gives us the environment screen. And from here, we now have the option to view our environments that we've got available to us and or create new ones. So I will click New. And Charles, do you just want to talk us a bit about what we're seeing here? We've talked about this previously, but just for a recap.
Yeah, so there aren't too many options that you get when you click on that new button, but you do have progressive disclosures. So sometimes you might toggle something or change something, and then you'll ask for additional information. The very first thing you're going to enter is the name of the environment. But you don't want to just enter any old name. What you really want to think about is what's the naming strategy that we're going to go for, because there's a very good chance you could be using this naming strategy in the future to help you with your automations. So say, for example, you want to always identify your pre-production environments. Well, then you need to decide, well, how are we going to call our pre-production environments? Maybe also you want to identify particular business units. You might want to prefix it so that you know which business unit the environment belongs to.
Yeah, so it's a good point, isn't it? Making sure that your naming convention makes sense to your organization and also makes sense logically, right? Because if you've got lots of abbreviated words, it can get quite confusing quite quickly. So making sure there's a good balance. So if we were to go through this ourselves in this video, we want to create a developer environment that's specific to our business unit. Let's see, that's finance, for example. Then you could quite easily do something like finance, and then power squared to make it make sense. And then you're starting to talk about a relatively understandable naming convention then, right?
Yeah, that's right. And also you can flip that on its head. So you could have power squared finance dev. That's another way of doing things.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, it's dependent on your organization. You might already have a naming convention for other services, and does it make sense to use that, or does it make sense just to kind of think about how that's going to work and how it could scale as well? So if you're going to use Power Platform more widely, how's that going to scale across business unit, across department, use case, that type of thing. So really something to think about when creating an environment is, are you being compliant with a naming convention? And if you don't have one, maybe think about that before you start going and creating all these environments.
One of the other things to consider is, where is this name going to appear? So who does it matter to? And it basically, for the most part, just matters to admins and makers. So the end user, when you're sharing an app with them, they're not going to be paying any attention to the environment name, or unless they're a tester or something like that. Yeah. But generally, they don't really care about what the environment name is. Whereas someone who's building things within Power Platform, they will be the one looking at the name, or an admin who needs to understand what the environment belongs to, what's the purpose of it. They'll be deciphering that most likely through the name.
Yeah, that makes sense. So some good thought required there before you go and just start creating them. If you create a developer environment through the Microsoft kind of Power Apps page, it will automatically create one with your login name, though, won't it? That's something to think about when creating a developer environment that isn't through the admin center.
It will, yeah. And that can be confusing because that person's name might also have some commonly used words in it. So it might be confusing at first that you might not think that it's a developer environment until you look at the type of environment, and it could take some time. It might be confusing. One of the things you can do is you can actually automate the renaming of that. So whenever a developer environment is created, I want to immediately give it a prefix of dev hyphen, for example, and then I know that's a developer environment. So there are ways around that, and we'll talk more about automation in the future.
Good stuff. Yeah, I think that's something our viewers will be looking forward to is how we can automate this stuff, because we like to automate the boring here at Power Squared. So do look out for that. So let's move on, because there's lots of options here, right, to think about. We've got, and we should really have a klaxon or something for this every time we mention it. We've got our first mention of managed environment again. So what we're doing if we turn this setting on?
So if you turn that setting on, you'll immediately make it a managed environment, of course, which means that anyone who's consuming anything in that environment needs to have a premium license. So either Power Apps Premium, Power Automate Premium.
Yeah.
Also, it means it will force Dataverse to be enabled on the environment. So that's something to bear in mind.
Yeah, it's really, really important to know whether, if you've got licensing across the organization, or everyone that's going to be using this environment has the right license, making it a managed one, in my mind, is a no-brainer, but definitely something to think about depending on your licensing kind of situation within your organization. Next up, we've got group. That ties into managed environment, doesn't it? So what happens if we select a group here?
So the group is an environment group, which is part of managed environments. So you can choose an environment group there, which then, of course, automatically makes it a managed environment, which automatically enables Dataverse as well. So you have this knock-on effect. If you're using environment groups, that's for generally overriding particular settings on an environment, but at a group level. But it can also help with just generally grouping your environments.
When we talk about environment grouping in managed environments, it's a great way to logically group our environments, isn't it? Because if we want to have a group for developer environments, you can more easily govern that kind of environment. So we've talked about that briefly in the past and on previous episodes. But again, environment grouping is a real powerful feature, and again, a massive benefit of using a managed environment. So something to consider. We've got region next. I think that one's fairly self-explanatory. One thing to point out around region is, obviously, there's a number of them. It makes sense to pick the one that is the closest to you geographically. We're coming to you from the United Kingdom, so that's why it's our default. But if you're in the United States, or you're in a European location, then obviously pick which one is most relevant to you. Worth noting that some of these regions, if you select it, for example, United States, you get the nice shiny option to get new features early. So something to consider if you want bleeding edge, latest and greatest, get everything before the kind of mainstream releases, then you might need to choose a different release. Good thing to maybe think about if you've got multiple environments as part of your environment strategy, and you want to see what's coming through the kind of Microsoft pipeline in terms of feature set.
So one way that could be important is if you're worried about a new feature breaking your software. So you might have a separate environment that you've spun up that gets those new features early for you then to test that everything works appropriately in that environment before it then comes through to your main production environment.
Yeah, no, definitely. Good thing to keep an eye on and potentially look at if you're in a kind of large organization, I would say. Next up, we've got environment type. We've talked quite fairly in detail about that in our previous video around kind of different environment types. I think for this one, we've called this dev. So let's make it developer environment, which we know we're not going to incur any Dataverse costs for that. It's all free to do, so it's a good option to choose if you're wanting to kind of play around with kind of Power Platform components solutions, before doing anything more kind of in anger, so to speak. We've got purpose, which again, self-explanatory again, isn't it? Really, just around describing. If you want to give a bit of a description around your environment, you can do that. Just gives you a bit more of an insight as to the purpose, and that's that. There's this interesting option that's just appeared though when we click developer, and it's create on behalf. What does that mean?
So because it's a developer environments are owned by someone. So this create on behalf is you as an admin, you're saying whether you're creating this developer environment to be owned by someone else, or if you say no, then you're creating that developer environment for yourself. So you will be the owner of it.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So,
and we can have up to 3 developer environments. Is that right?
3, that's right. Yeah. And as an admin, I can go in and create developer environments for, my organization's makers if I wanted to, or if we wanted to control that kind of process and more tightly govern it, then that's a great feature to kind of have as part of that, isn't it? So that's why that exists.
Yeah. And so even with environment routing, so environment routing automatically creates a developer environment when someone accesses Power Platform. They might need an additional developer environment for another use case. So this is where you could then create that for them.
We can see here, selected type developer, it's immediately grayed out the add a Dataverse store, and we can see here, because it's a developer environment, we must always have Dataverse as a result, which is great. But if we choose a different type, for example, I think production, we do have the option to not create an environment with Dataverse. What's the implication of that by just not creating a Dataverse database for us?
Well, if you're not paying for additional licensing, then potentially you don't want to enable Dataverse. So in a production environment or a sandbox environment, maybe you're having your system developers or your makers build things. You don't want them to use Dataverse. You might want to leave that unticked. It makes it easier to control what they can and can't do in the environment. When Dataverse is enabled, there's a lot more that you can do with an environment. So that could be one way of deciding to lock it down if you don't have the licensing available.
Okay, that's interesting. There's lots of kind of thought process behind that, isn't there? So if you wanted to maybe keep it as like an environment purely for SharePoint-based solutions, and that could be a good option. Equally, if you're not using Dataverse at all, and you're maybe using something more in the enterprise kind of scale, such as SQL, again, that could be a good option, right? Even though you still need a premium license for it, but you don't need Dataverse. You can completely skip all of that and just build non-Dataverse solutions. Lastly, on this page here, or this flyout section here, we've got pay-as-you-go with Azure. And again, you can see it's grayed out on no because we're creating a developer environment. But if we were using a sandbox or production, we could set up pay-as-you-go with Azure. Yeah, if we're, rather than paying for premium licensing, using something like a Power Apps premium license, we could pay-as-you-go with Azure. So what that means is that any usage is billed through an Azure billing policy that you need to set up in Azure. And then any users that access or interface with anything that requires premium, rather than it being done through the licensing aspect, it will then get billed at the Azure level instead. So you're paying as you go. I would say it's a really good option if you're, evaluating you're not ready to pull the trigger on, premium for loads of users. Maybe you've got a small use case app that maybe only a set few people access, maybe, once every so often, but it's got premium. It's a good kind of use case for that. But definitely something to look into and think about when you're creating an environment. Is pay-as-you-go a good option for you? And to think about kind of the impact on pricing and whether you want to go down that Azure route or down the actual Power Apps premium route instead. Moving on, so we click next now.
Can I just say before that, so we have a next button now, but the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that didn't always say next. So for example, if you change the type away from developer, maybe put it back to production or sandbox, and then we don't have a Dataverse store, that button that said next now says save. So the only reason why it's saying next is when we've got Dataverse enabled, because there are more settings we can configure purely from a Dataverse perspective.
Yeah, that's right. So our next page, if we're using Dataverse, we are going to have to configure some Dataverse specific settings next. If we click that now, here's where we can configure the Dataverse specific kind of settings. There's not a lot here really, is there? I mean, the first one's obvious. It's just around language. You can see there's a few. So obviously pick the language that is most relevant to yourself. Obviously we're coming to you from the UK, so English is what we'd pick. There isn't an English UK, it's just English United States, so that's fine. Currency, again, that's self-explanatory, isn't it? We were just talking around kind of what currency, if you're going to be using any kind of currency-based columns or anything like that within your solution, that is the default currency that is going to be used. And then URL, what's that?
Yeah, so when an environment is created, it has a unique URL. And this is where you can configure the prefix to that URL. So it's basically, for those who remember subdomains, it's a subdomain. So you'll have your, whatever you enter there, .crm, potentially a number there, .dynamics.com. So it's for you to have a more understandable, more distinguishable URL when you're visiting that environment. I think it helps a lot to have that URL, because when you're providing a link to someone else, they can then see which environment it's coming from that URL.
Yeah, so generally good practice to set it, you would say. I would say it's always a good
practice
to set it, yeah. So let's do that. Let's say dev hyphen fin hyphen power squared. Perfect, and that's going to create it with that URL for us. And there's another toggle here, deploy sample apps and data. So fairly self-explanatory, isn't it? If we click yes there, what's it actually going to deploy though?
In Dataverse, you have a set number of standard tables that always exist. Things like account and contact. It's part of what they called the common data model, but I think they're moving away from using that terminology. And so when you deploy sample data, it will have fake accounts and fake contacts in there so that you can start building straight away with some usable data.
Yeah, it's a good way just to get going quickly without having to create, dummy records yourself, isn't it? So, of course, in the age of AI, we can get, AI to generate some of this stuff for us now, but it's still a really good option to get going quickly, isn't it? So, important to think about. So if I click save now, this is going to actually go and create the environment.
It sets off a chain of events. So this is a trigger for it to then start going off and doing all the things it needs to do to prepare that environment. Particularly if it's going to have Dataverse, it needs to enable Dataverse on the environment.
Yeah, as you can see now, our environment has been created. It's state ready, which means it's there, ready to go. It's got Dataverse. It's not managed. One thing that it hasn't done for us, though, Charles, which we get in other environment types, is allow us to specify environment security. And that's because that's a developer type, isn't it? So do you just want to give us a bit of a kind of quick lesson in how that works and why we want to do that?
Yeah, so as we talked about in our previous video where we mentioned security groups can be tied to environments, and what we can have when we create a new environment, if it's say a production or a sandbox environment, is that it will ask us for a security group to be attached to the environment because that's best practice. You can choose none, but I would recommend not doing that unless you have a very good reason for it, because that security group is going to control who gets access to that environment. So you really only want people to have access to the environment if they're in the security group.
So let's look at the environment then. So what I would typically do is now go to make.powerapps.com. Now this is going to load up. We should hopefully see now our environment in the environment list here on the top right. We click on environment. And you can see there is our environment. It's been created. I can click into it. we now have a shiny, brand new environment where we can now build our solutions, and it's all going to be contained in here, ready to go. So our environment's been created, it's gone and provisioned that for us. We're ready to go and build our solutions. It's quite long-winded though, isn't it, to do that every single time? If you're doing that day to day, or you're managing lots of environments, lots of requests for environment creation, for example, it can get quite tedious quite quickly. So enter automation, and there's lots of kind of ways we can do that within Power Platform, isn't there? So do you want to talk about what we could do there, Charles?
Yeah, sure. So let's go for the low-code route first, shall we? So there's a connector that we can use called Power Platform for Admins. And that connector, we can use it in Power Apps or Power Automate. And so that gives us a very easy way of doing this. We've got lots of different actions that we can use with the connector. One of those is to create a new environment. Another one of those actions, so yeah, we've got the create environment action there. Another one of the actions is create CDS database. And CDS is what Dataverse used to be called. So that's essentially enabling Dataverse in the environment. So through this connector, we can create an environment, we can enable Dataverse, and we can do a bunch of other different things. So that's one way that we could go about automating creating environments. So we have some other ways as well, don't we? Less of a low-code way. How can we do that, Josh?
Yeah, so I think, the Power Automate approach is quite a good kind of low-code way, isn't it? Maybe if you're familiar with Power Automate, that's a good way to kind of get started and create some automation and governance around it. But if you want to go a bit more kind of traditional development, we've got something called Pack CLI, which is a command line interface. And it does a lot more than just allow you to create an environment. There's a whole bunch of tools, so we'll link that and the Power Automate one in the description below. But yeah, you can use this, use the Pack CLI, install it as part of VS Code or independently, and you can use this to create an environment. What's great about this is you can then automate pipelines by doing this as well. So you could have a pipeline that deals with environment creation, and that way you're creating a standardized environment every single time when you run that pipeline. So no more clicking through all of those settings. You hit run once you've configured it once, and off it goes. It's that and the Power Automate, I should mention, method are both really good at creating standardized environment creation methods. And Charles, I think you mentioned there's another method, isn't there, to do that? Do you want to talk about what that final one is?
Yeah, sure. Before moving on to that, I just want to just clarify the pipeline comment that it's Azure DevOps pipelines or GitHub Actions, but not native Power Platform pipelines. So if you're going the native Power Platform pipelines route, doesn't really make sense for environment creation, but you'd have to use like the Power Platform for Admins connector through that with Power Automate. Yeah. So yeah, the other way that you can do things, which is not a supported way, I believe, is using what's called the BAP API. So it's the Business Applications API or something along those lines. And this is essentially the API that the admin center is using whenever you click on things. So you click to create an environment in the admin center, it's sending a post request to an API. You can reuse that API, and you can use the HTTP request connector that's pre-authorized with your Entra ID in Power Automate. Very technical, but you can send those requests via that, and you can essentially copy whatever the admin center is doing. So it's a very technical way and has a lot more setup, but you can potentially do more than you can get access to through the Power Automate Power Apps connector here or through the Pack CLI. But a lot of that functionality is coming through to the Pack CLI as well. And there are other ways that you can use the Pack CLI, can't you? So you can use it in pipelines, like you say. You can also use it in PowerShell. So you could have a run book with PowerShell that automatically creates your environments and configures them. Anything else that we could do?
Loads of things. Too many to think of right now. And I think that's a great thing when we start talking about automation with Power Platform, is it's been designed to allow for all of these things to be automated. And that's what's so great about it. And talking about that in the environment kind of lens and perspective just kind of gives you a bit of a slight insight into where we can go with this, and it's really interesting, isn't it? So definitely topics there that we'll be diving into in the future, and we really look forward to talking about them, don't we?
Absolutely. I can't wait to start talking about automation. I love it. One of my favorite parts.
Definitely, yeah. It's really interesting. So we look forward to going into that and in a more deep dive in the future. But for now, I think that's everything that we've got to show for today. So we've been your hosts, and thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.